I'd like to spend some time with you today talking about another story that happened on that very first Easter Sunday. The Bible says there were two people who were on a trip, who were walking to the village of Emmaus. We find out in the story the name of one of the characters was Cleopas. And perhaps the person with Cleopas was his wife. Could have been another friend, it could have been another guy who was with him, but it very well might have been his wife. At any rate, these two people were traveling. They were walking to Emmaus, and they were talking to each other about all the things that had happened in recent days in Jerusalem. You see, they were disciples. They were followers of Jesus Christ. Now, Cleopas wasn't one of the 12 disciples, but he was one of the people who was following Jesus and was very intrigued with what he was saying. And the Bible says that these two people were discussing all these things that had gone on. And while they were walking, all of a sudden a third person came and joined them. And that person who joined them was Jesus. But they were unable to recognize that it was Jesus who was walking with them. And he asked them, "What are you two discussing as you walk along?" And they stood still. They kind of froze when Jesus asked that question, and their faces were downcast. They were upset. They were discouraged. And one of them, the one that's called Cleopas, said, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And Jesus said, "Well, what things?" It must have sounded incredibly stupid to not have any awareness, seemingly, of what had happened in Jerusalem the last couple of days. But Cleopas and the person walking with Cleopas were eminently aware and discouraged and depressed about what had happened in Jerusalem concerning the crucifixion of Jesus. And so they answered, they said, "Well, about Jesus of Nazareth, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But here's why they were so discouraged and upset about it. They said, we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. They had hoped, you see, that he was the one who was going to conquer the evil powers at that time, not seemingly be conquered by those powers. The Messiah wasn't supposed to be, so they thought, crucified. Certainly if you want a great heroic leader, you don't want that heroic leader to die. So they had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And the text goes on to say, what is more, it's the third day since this took place. In addition, they said, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. But the two people walking, like many people in that time period, when they heard the testimony of the women, they didn't particularly believe them. Now, of course, the reader knows that the women were exactly right. But Cleopas and the person walking with Cleopas found their testimony to be doubtful. Text goes on, it says, then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it was just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. And so they're wondering what has happened to Jesus. They realize things aren't right, things are unsettled, they're confused, they're despondent, they're depressed. But Jesus said to them this, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, if we pause here for just a moment, there's a couple of things that we need to observe. In our world, in the West, for the last several centuries, We have often thought of Jesus as this guy who introduced this new religion. Often this has been described as something completely divorced from anything before Jesus. Jesus came and introduced a new religion called Christianity. And we usually think of religion in terms of kind of a series of coherent, abstract ideas about maybe God, about the nature of man, maybe about the afterlife, about evil. But we normally think of religion as being something that is abstract, something that philosophers love to talk about, but something that is generally quite detached from our world. To help you understand what I mean by this, if we have a child who is in school, say they even go to a Christian school, when they're in school, they'll have math. And then they will stop with math. And then they will study science. But science is contained. And then they'll stop that and they'll study maybe next history. And then after that, they'll stop. And then they might even study Bible or religion. But it's regarded as a subject that is separate and distinct from all the other academic disciplines. And this line of thinking really came out of enlightenment, right? Like if you go to university, the College of Religion might be on one side of the university, political science on quite the other. Now, that's often the way we think of religion in our world. And we have often put Jesus in a category based on our perception of the way different disciplines and different ideas are divided. But in Jesus' world, there was nothing of the sort. There were no divisions of this. For example, if you were a Jewish boy going to school in the days of Jesus, when you were taught history, history was understood to be theology. It was understood to be God's working in the world. If you were to study the weather was understood as what God was doing in our world. So to study the weather was to study religion. To study history was to study religion. To study literature was to study religion. In fact, the literature they had far and away was religious literature, whether it be poetry or history or whatnot. It was all regarded as religious. All of life was religious for the Jewish people. In fact, political science, politics, was part of religion. The idea of Caesar and who he was a deeply religious idea, not just for the Jews, as a matter of fact, but for the rest of the Roman world as well. To talk about Caesar was to talk about theology. To talk about God's people in relation to Caesar was to talk about theology. And to talk about the plight and the suffering and the poverty of the people in Judea was to talk about religion. These were inseparable for them. Now, the reason I bring this out is because this is critical if we're to really understand what Christianity is all about. We've got to stop putting it in this separate compartment in which it is separated from all the other aspects of life. All the disciplines should be interwoven with theology, or theology is interwoven in all the other disciplines. They're inseparable. They certainly were in Jesus' world. And so if we're going to understand the things Jesus said, and if we're going to understand the things Jesus' contemporaries said, then we've got to get out of our enlightenment mode of thinking and begin to think of the world in a much more theologically integrated place. This plays a role in our story here. Notice what Jesus said again. He said, "How foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken." Right from the start, see, Jesus believes that his story is in continuity with, or even the climax of, the story and the theology that have been expressed by the prophets through time. And if we think about the things the prophets said, the prophets didn't elaborate on philosophical or idealistic ideas. They didn't operate in a world of idealism and abstract. They spoke to the concrete realities of their own worlds. They were very much part of history in the unfolding of God's story in our world. And Jesus saw himself as the climax of that story. He went on to say this, did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? See, the irony is, while the people thought redemption would come through a mighty battle where Messiah was going to conquer the foes in the way we normally think of warfare, Jesus rather is the Messiah who was going to redeem Israel through suffering. If we think about this, it's maybe not so hard to imagine, because every tyrant in the world has always borrowed power from a higher power in order to keep control in power. You see, every dictator has always borrowed power from death itself, because death is the ultimate tyrant in our world. And so tyrants borrow power from death. They are able to stay in a position of power by threatening death to their subjects. But here's what Jesus did. Jesus chose to face not the lower power of Rome or the more diminished power of the chief priests. He chose to face the ultimate tyrant, death itself. And he conquered death itself on Easter. Now, if tyrants derive their power from death, and death is defeated, then tyrants no longer have any real power. They've been defeated, and God's people have been redeemed from tyrannical powers. Jesus went on to say, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all scriptures concerning himself. He's the fulfillment of all scriptures. And when we say that, we don't mean that anecdotally here and there the prophets or Moses managed to say something that predicted somebody way down the line. Again, Moses and the prophets were part of a story in their own time, and part of the natural outflowing of the great big meta-narrative, the big story of the Bible is that Jesus is the climax to the great big story. That's a major point that Luke desires for us to understand when we read his gospel. Let me give you a couple examples from the very beginning of the gospel of Luke to demonstrate what I mean. When we look at 1 Samuel opens with this scene at the tabernacle, right? And we find a priest who is terribly corrupt, Eli. Particularly his sons are corrupt. But we find this woman who is in desperation, Hannah. She longs to have a child. And she finds out she's going to have a child. And upon having the child, she's going to bring him back to the tabernacle. And he will be raised there, and he will be a special servant of God. That's the essence of the story. When we look at the beginning of Luke, we first encounter characters in the temple, the new tabernacle. Indeed, we encounter a priest who is given a promise concerning his wife, who's going to have a child, even though it seemed impossible. And then, very shortly after that, the angel comes to Mary. And Mary is told that she is going to have a child. And then we have Mary praising the Lord. In her praise, her what we call the Magnificat, her voice or her song of praise in Luke sounds so much like the song that Hannah sang back in 1 Samuel. Do you see what's happening then? Luke sees Jesus' story as being an echo of stories from the Old Testament. There's new twists, things happen in different ways, but Mary is very much like Hannah. She gives birth to Jesus in extremely unlikely circumstances. We even have a scene at the tabernacle, or rather at the temple, which reminds us of the tabernacle, the first scene. In fact, when Jesus is very young, Mary and Joseph go to the temple to present Jesus to the Lord and to offer sacrifices. It's there where they encounter a prophetess whose name is Anna. After their time in the at the temple. Mary and Joseph are on their journey home. They realize Jesus isn't with them. He's stayed at the temple for the past 3 days, and they have to go back and get him. Well, remember, this is like Samuel, who was purposely left at the temple because he had a role to play at the temple. God had assigned him a role, and he was fulfilling that role. And the person who praised Jesus and pronounced blessing in that situation, her name was Anna, which is a variation of the name Hannah. Again, there's echoes, and we could trace all through Luke, and there's just a plethora of echoes of the biblical story all through Luke's gospel. In fact, all 4 gospel writers in their own ways have echoes of the Old Testament that reverberate all through their story. Point is this: Jesus is the climax of the story. Beyond that, the point is this: Christianity is not merely about adapting a set of abstract ideas. It is rather about becoming part of the story of what God is doing in His world. And when we lose ourselves and become part of God's bigger story, then we find that we're characters that are living in continuity with the biblical story. The story of the Bible is living on even in our own world. Not as people privately practicing religion in isolation from one another, or even practicing religion as something merely that happens on Sundays or in private. No, Christianity, when we understand it correctly, naturally is integrated in every other aspect of life. History is theological. Politics are theological. Medicine is theological. And as we engage the biblical story, as we live our lives in continuity with that story, we begin to discover how we can be part of living out the story that started in the Bible. The story's not over. You have the opportunity to become part of that story as well. Well, back to Cleopas and the person walking with Cleopas and Jesus. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Right there, you should hear echoes of other stories, not least the Last Supper. Also when Jesus fed the 5,000. But if we go way back in time, the very first meal that we find out about is when Adam and Eve were in the garden and they ate food they weren't supposed to eat. Now, do you remember what happened in that story? After Adam and Eve ate the fruit from the knowledge, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they suddenly were able to see. But they were able to see in a different light. They discovered they were both naked and they made a covering for themselves. In other words, they could see, but what they could see wasn't good. They felt shame, they saw shame, and they covered themselves. And then very shortly after that, of course, they're going to be exiled from the garden. Look what happens in this story. Then their eyes were opened. That is, after Jesus gave them their food, he broke it, he began to give it to them. We get the idea they're eating it. And then their eyes were opened and they recognized him and he disappeared from their sight. Do you see what just happened? It's the inverse of the story of the fall. The people were without sin. They ate and then they saw, but what they saw wasn't good. In our story on the road to Emmaus, the two people saw Jesus, but they didn't really see Jesus. They didn't comprehend who he was until they ate the food that Jesus provided. Then their eyes were opened and they saw Jesus as he was. The story of the fall of man is told, but in a totally new and radically different way. And they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? They started with fear and concern and terror and doubt and confusion. And now, after encountering Jesus, after understanding who he is, after understanding that Messiah had to suffer, after understanding suffering in a new light, then they understood who Jesus was. Then their eyes are opened. And so they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Every time we break the bread at the supper, prayerfully we recognize who Jesus is. We're challenged, you and I, to study this story, to understand it as a story, not a set of abstract theological ideas, but as a story, so that by examining it as a story, we can find ways to make our own story or to live our own story in continuity with the biblical story. That's what Easter is about. Giving us the opportunity to have a new life, a new existence, new life for what purpose? To live in continuity with the story that Jesus has already begun. How do you need to respond to this story today? Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Amen.